Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Esther chapter 1. We're going to be starting verse 19 this lesson. Before we begin though, Jeremiah 15:16, thy words were found and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, the king here is receiving counsel from his counselors as to what to do with Vashti, and Memucan is speaking. And now we get into verse 19, and it says, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. Now, in Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 and 17, we see Peter's great confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. But in verse 17, it says that Peter made the confession because God had been working in Peter's heart and mind and revealed this truth to Peter. So Peter makes this great confession, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, you've made this confession because God revealed it unto you. Now, in verse 19, we see, in verse 19 here of Esther chapter 1, we see another instance of the providence of God working in men's hearts, right? In order to bring about his purpose. As God worked in Peter's heart to make that confession, so also God is going to be working in men's hearts, in Memucan's hearts, the king's hearts, to bring about his purpose. All right? Memucan did not say, forgive her, or cause her to not see the king for 3 months, right? Or anything like this, right? Memucan didn't say anything about forgiving her or giving her time off. Right? She needed to be removed from her position so that God could bring in Esther, and Esther would be able to move the heart of the king towards the Jewish people. So God is using Memucan in his counsel to basically remove Vashti from being queen so that God can bring in Esther to bring about his plan. Now, it says here in verse 19, what? That it be not altered. That it be not altered. Now, and it literally means that it pass not away. So Memucan wanted the king to make a decree or make a law, and so that forever and ever and ever it would never pass away, this law. All right? We also see the providence of God in this request by Memucan. How do we see God's providence? Because the king's anger would cool down, and Vashti would come in and find pleasure in his eyes again. And she would keep her position as queen. Thus, there would be no need for Esther. Also, by making a royal command, the king would not be able to reverse it without bringing disgrace upon himself. So this was God working in the heart of Memucan, whether he didn't, I'm sure he didn't know about it, but God was working in the heart of Memucan to get rid of Vashti permanently. Not just to get rid of her for a little time, but to get rid of her permanently and to bring someone else in her spot that God wanted there. All right? Now, verse 20 and 21, it says, "And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all of his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and to small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan." Now, it says all wives will honor their husbands, right? Well, of course they will. Of course they're going to do this. Why? Because if the queen could not get away with it, then they're not going to be able to get away with it either. If the queen can disobey the king and get punished by it, well, then they better toe the line also, right? Now, if you notice in this portion of scripture, the description of the punishment that the average woman in the province would receive is never given, right? Memucan doesn't say, well, any wives in the provinces that disobey their husbands, this will be their punishment. No, Memucan doesn't give any, there's no punishment for only the punishment, right? Only Queen Vashti's punishment is given, but not the punishment for those that are out in the provinces. And there is one thing that this decree does not take into account. There's one thing that this decree does not take into account, and that is love. All right? It doesn't take love into account. The king is legislating obedience, but he's not legislating love. Love in a family cannot be legislated. But when love does exist in a family, there will always be willing submission by both people. You know, you can legislate people and tell them to obey, but you can't legislate love. But when there is love, love automatically brings in obedience to the other person. For a wife to honor her husband doesn't mean that she loves him, but to love her husband will always bring honor to him. All right? I mean, you can legislate, you love that man, right? You love that man with all your heart. Well, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. But if she loves him with all her heart, then she will obey him. And the same with him. If he loves her, he'll obey her. He'll be kind to her. He'll provide for her, right? Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 12. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She shall do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Right? And verse 23, says, her husband is known in the gates. Why is he known? He's known in the gates because of his wife. His wife gave him that prominence. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land, right? And it's by love that men are given honor, by a good, virtuous wife. You can't legislate virtue. You can't legislate love. in a family. And this is what this decree does not include. It doesn't include anything about love. It just demands obedience. Obey, 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 right? Many marriages have been shipwrecked because one required honor without initiating love first, right? In 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 to 16, you can read it if you'd like. Rehoboam learned quickly that to demand obedience from his people instead of loving them into obedience will only cause them to resist his authority. Right? A king can't legislate obedience. I mean, they can. Yes, they can legislate obedience. But the Rehoboam's, the counselors that stood at Solomon's side and listened to Solomon, now Solomon is dead, and his son Rehoboam takes the throne, and he calls them in and says, "What do you counsel me?" And they said, "If you love your people and give your life to them, they'll love you back and give you all their obedience." And he rejected the counsel and went to the young people's council, the council of his own peers, and which was demanding obedience and instilling fear in their hearts. Verse 22, "For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people." Now, this is a very interesting verse. You would think, you just read it and you say, okay, it kind of self-explanatory, it tells, but there's more. There's more in this verse than you think, all right? Verse 22, "Again, they did not have TVs or computers or satellites in the sky," right? "This took time for all the provinces to be covered with this information, with this decree." Because he says here, verse 22, "Let letters be sent into all the king's provinces," right? Into every province according to the writing thereof. So it took time. I mean, they had to get on horses and camels and whatever, mules, donkeys, and start heading out, send the messengers out to all these provinces. "Women, obey your husbands," right? That's what it's a decree from the king, so you have to do it. And but it took time. Now, the last part of this verse, it says that every man should bear rule in his own house. All right? That every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Now, the King James Version did a terrible job translating this verse. What the last part of this verse should say, what it should say is that every man should bear rule in his own house and should speak the language of his own people in his own house, and not to speak the language of the wife, right? If her language is different. So, basically what it's saying is if a person in a province marries another woman, and she speaks a different language, and her speaks a different language than the husband, then the husband's language rules in the house, not the wife's. The husband's language, and the children are to be brought up in that language. All right? If the wives were foreign, And then they had to learn his language and speak it in the house. This is what it's saying. I'm telling you, I've studied it. This is what it's saying. It doesn't, the King James Version did a terrible version, translating this last part of this verse. It means that the wife needs, the household speaks the husband's language. And if the wife is from a different language, she must learn the language of the husband, so that in the house, not only does the husband rule, but the husband's language rules also in the house. Now, obviously, there would be men that would marry foreign women. The husband's language would be ruled in the house. The king was not setting up a one language nation. That's what he wasn't doing. To have uniformity in the family under the husband's rule, everyone in the family had to speak the father's language. All right? So this is how the king is setting up. Not only does the husband rule the household, but his language also. Part of the authority of the husband is that, well, his language rules in the house. And the kids are to be brought up in everybody. All right? So the king wasn't decreeing that everybody speak one language. No, it's that in your home, one language rules, and it's the father's. The husband's language rules in the house. All right? We're going to start chapter 2 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.